the summer of 1968, Paul McCartney called renowned war photographer Don McCullin and asked him to photograph the Beatles for a day. The band needed new marketing photos and to get away from the recording studio for a while. The day picked was July 28, 1968. The Beatles and McCullin were joined by 5 other photographers: Ronald Fitzgibbon, Stephen Goldblatt, Tom Murray, Tony Bromwell, and Mal Evans, as well as Yoko Ono, McCartney's girlfriend Francie Schwartz, and Mal Evans' 6-year-old son, Gary Evans. So in today's video, we'll go over Tom Murray's background and how he ended up photographing the Beatles. But first and foremost, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a big thumbs up. So picture this: you get to photograph the Beatles, and that will be your breaking point, through which you'll get your fame and spark in your work. How does that sound to you? Dream come true, right? Tell us in the comments, if you were to photograph the Beatles, how will you go about it? Tom Murray's background. Tom Murray is a multi-award-winning photographer whose work has appeared in magazines, plays, portraits, and newspapers. He was the youngest person ever commissioned to shoot the royal family at the age of 25, and he went on to photograph some of the world's most important artists and designers, including Elizabeth Taylor and Ralph Lauren. Among the vast collection of material, one day in particular stands out for Beatles fans: a memorable shoot in July 1968, which he dubbed the Beatles' Mad Day Out. Murray, a 25-year-old assignment assistant, captured some of the most brilliant and realistic photos of the Beatles ever taken. Murray has chronicled that day in a new book, Tom Murray's Mad Day Out, with the help of writers Simon Weitzman and designer Paul Skellett, which launched during the August 2016 Fest for Beatles fans in Chicago. Murray is 74 years old. He had his own little experience photographing royals in 1969 when he looked more like Peter Noone of Herman's Hermits than he does now. He'd gotten his job at the Sunday Times color magazine with the help of photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones, also known as Lord Snowdon, Princess Margaret's husband, and the two of them frequently collaborated. Snowdon instructed him to bring a camera to Kensington Palace one day. I photographed him, Princess Margaret, and their children in an Aston Martin, gazing back over the boot, he explained. A small old lady pulled at my shirt and inquired what I was doing while I was shooting. Auntie Alice would be Queen Victoria's last living grandchild. Murray and Princess Margaret, whom he referred to as M, became close friends. They went to the movies and he took the kids fishing. A corgi dog bit my ankles once at Buckingham Palace, he recalled. As I gently brushed it away, a voice asked, "Who are you?" The voice was revealed to be Queen Elizabeth's. When I informed her what happened, she answered, "Oh, don't worry, that one does that all the time." Now this was all about Tom before his photography with the Beatles. Let's see how it went down for him when he got hired for the gig. How it all began. On a summer day in 1968, he got his second big break. According to Murray, Don McCullin, a renowned war photographer and Sunday Times colleague, requested Murray to drive him around while he photographed a musical ensemble. Murray remarked, "I knew more about music than he did. I figured I'd get a few pictures, so I grabbed a Nikon and 2 rolls of Ektachrome." Murray stated that as they got to the Times, he heard someone playing Lady Madonna on a piano. When we walked in, there were the Beatles, and I thought, "Oh shit. Didn't I tell you?" said Don. McCullin shot a photograph that appeared on the cover of Life 2 months later, and the group then proceeded on an adventure known to Beatles scholars as the Mad Day Out. They were working on the White Album, and they despised their publicity shots, Murray explained. John wanted to be taken close to Karl Marx's mausoleum, but when we arrived at Highgate Cemetery, the gate was barred, so they stood in front of a neighboring small home, and we shot them there. Murray later discovered that 2 small girls inside the house had yelled, "Dad, Dad, outside are the Beatles," but their father had not believed them, and by the time he arrived at the window, they had already left. Prints of 23 of Murray's Mad Day images are now on display at Soho Contemporary Art at the Bowery and Houston intersection. The larger ones start at $6,000, while the smaller ones start at $3,000. Murray said as he signed and numbered a poster, "That day was a gift from God. If I'd known who we were going to shoot with, I would have puked twice and brought 4 cameras and 100 rolls of film." A gallery employee carefully lifted the signed photograph. I don't mean to be disrespectful, but most of Don's photos from that day are terrible. Murray continued, "Mine, on the other hand, is bloody fantastic. My days of saying things were fine are long gone. They are unrivaled. When I returned home, my mother inquired how my day went, and I answered, it was extremely wonderful," he writes. When she questioned what I was up to, I replied, I spent all day photographing the Beatles and shut the door. She cried and screamed. Would you go crazy all over, scream and cry if you got such a job? That day would be remembered as the last advertising shoot in which the band would take part before disbanding the following year. Despite the fact that the day became renowned, Murray's photographs generally sat in a drawer until 1998, when he displayed the 23 images he had collected over the years. Murray spoke with Rebeat, a digital blog magazine largely focused on mid-century music, culture, and lifestyle, from his home in England about his career, new book, and how an accidental assignment developed into one of the Beatles' most iconic picture shootings. Rebeat: how did you become a photographer? How did you end up with this particular assignment? Tom Murray: I began my career working for local newspapers. I worked with linotype and the press, and we rushed outside to snap shots whenever we could. I worked in newspapers for 4.5 years before meeting someone who worked with United Press International and asking if I wanted to work abroad. There's a job going in what was Northern Rhodesia in Africa, he stated around 6 months later. After 4.5 years in Africa, I asked my employer if I could take an extra 2 weeks off with pay to return home by ship, but he said no, so I told them to screw their job. You remind me of Lord Snowdon. One of their directors commented as I was leaving. Why? I inquired. Because you're arrogant, opinionated, and a good photographer, he explained. Editorial note: Anthony Charles Robert Armstrong Jones, 1st Earl of Snowdon, is a well-known British photographer with over 100 works in the collection of the National Portrait Gallery. He was the Sunday Times Magazine artistic advisor in the 1960s. So when I arrived home, I wrote to the top 4 photographers in England, and Snowdon responded. Lord Snowdon stated that 2 positions were available, one at Vogue and one at the Sunday Times Magazine, which included the country's first color supplement. I think you should take that one, he remarked. So I rushed to the Sunday Times and got the job. They wanted me to start on April 1st, 1968, but I refused because it was April Fool's Day. I'll start on April 2nd. What led you to photograph the Beatles? A few months later, on July 28, 1968, one of the other photographers mentioned that he was photographing a pop group and that I could drive them about. I said yes without thinking to ask who. Oh, we're going to use the studio. Bring your camera, they added. So I grabbed my camera, which I still use today, and for some reason, put 2 rolls of color film in my pocket. I'll never know why. Oh, someone's playing Lady Madonna on the piano, I said as we entered the rehearsal area. When I walked in, there was Paul McCartney, and then there were George and Ringo. I didn't have any of my regular accessories. I only had one camera, and we just drove around London. I simply took 23 photos and discarded the ones I didn't like. Tell me about the day's atmosphere. London was a lively street in the late 1960s. Hair was an award-winning musical, and Carnaby Street was alive with the Stones on one side and the Beatles on the other. London in the mid to late 1960s was spectacular. People wore uniforms, girls wore little skirts, I wore trousers so tight you couldn't sit down, platform shoes, flowery tops. It was all very different. But it was unusually quiet that Sunday. No matter where we went, many stores were closed on Sundays, and pubs didn't open until the afternoon, so it was quiet for a while. Paul McCartney's pictures are unusually open and lively. How did you get that from him? He'd look around to check if I was looking, and I'd pretend I wasn't. I learned this tactic years ago. I pretend I'm not paying attention, so I just played the game with Paul, checking to see if I was looking and watching out of the corner of my eye. That's how I got really cool shots of him squirting water all over the camera. I believe a lot of it was because they were unaware of what I was doing. So this was all, folks. It's truly remarkable to find how it all went so wonderful for Tom. I don't know about you guys, but if I were to photograph the Beatles, I would pass out in excitement. Would this be the case for you as well? Tell us in the comments below. Do subscribe to our channel and like our video. We'll see you in the next one.